We're joined today by Juston Klamm. He's the author of the new book, We're Not Worthy, From In Living Color to Mr. Show, How 90s Sketch TV Changed the Face of Comedy. Juston, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, you've got a new book out, We're Not Worthy, From In Living Color to Mr. Show, How 90s Sketch TV Changed the Face of Comedy. I guess it's in there in the title, but can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
Yeah, so it's about the history of 1990s TV sketch comedy. There's a little bit more in there in terms of history of the theaters as well, like Second City or the Groundlings, that are the places that most of these sketch comedians who were on TV in the 90s came from, and now as well. But yeah, since I grew up, I probably started watching sketch comedy in 1990. I just realized that it was the most prolific era of sketch comedy that there ever was. And I wanted to make sure I chronicled that and interview as many people as I can, because I've done other histories in the past, and you don't quite catch people in time. This is a good time to catch people who were active in the 90s.
I guess I didn't realize, but you look at more than 50 just in the book. I mean, why were there so many sketch comedies in the 90s? That's it seems like every network, every channel at least had one or two.
I think the success of Saturday Night Live 15 years prior to the decade left people trying to figure out how to get a piece of that pie. And nobody has yet really recreated that. But, it's because Lorne Michaels has some sort of secret sauce that he does, and he's smart. He does it at 11:30. Nobody else does it quite so late. But at the time, the one thing that TV did not have that we have so much of now was reality TV. And sketch comedy up until reality TV was the cheapest thing you could produce. It was easy. They didn't really pay people too well, but it was also cheap sets, cheap costumes, cheap wigs, cheap props. Sometimes that was the charm of it. And I think once reality TV crept in, which you can see happening on all these shows, because almost every show did their own parody of Cops, which was like the first big reality show. You can see that at some point they kind of they get taken over, and reality TV becomes the cheapest thing you can make. And you can make it for, a tenth of the cost even of a sketch show.
Well, Juston, can you talk a bit about, putting the book together itself? I know, as you mentioned, you interviewed a lot of people, and you've got a lot of major names here. Obviously, just about everybody got their start, it seems, in 90s sketch comedy.
Yeah, so I interviewed 150 people, and that includes people who did sketch or started in sketch well before the 90s as well. So I interviewed some people who were on literally TV's first sketch comedy show in the 50s, actually in the 40s. I interviewed somebody from there. I interviewed Carol Burnett as well from the 60s, although she did have a show in the 90s. But the big names of the 90s that people are probably going to be familiar with: Mike Myers, Bob Odenkirk, David Cross, Patton Oswalt, a bunch of people like that. And sketch has, I won't say a low bar to entry, but it sort of feels like it does. There's this DIY aesthetic. It's something that I talk about a lot in the book. It feels like something that you could make, and often people did make at home. If you're my age, you took your VHS camera or borrowed one from your dad's work, as I did, and you made your own sketches because it was cheap, it was easy, and it was something you could do on the fly. And I think that low bar to entry is what got a lot of these people into it. And eventually, some of them stayed in sketch, some of them still love sketch. Bob Odenkirk was a guy who has seen a bunch of success because of sketch, but also still loves it. It's still his favorite art form. So having conversations like that kind of blew my mind.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I know you mentioned SNL, of course, and you had Mad TV and Kids in the Hall, a lot of these long-running ones, but a lot of really short-lived ones in there, too. It kind of reminded me almost maybe of grunge music, like all the networks were kind of willing to greenlight any sketch shows that came along.
Yeah, that's a really fair comparison. And there was a show that is not an example of a short-lived one, but is one that fewer people know about, that parallels kind of the growth of grunge music, because they started in the early 80s and they ended in 1999, and it was called Almost Live. It was a Seattle sketch show. And they were there at the beginning of grunge, throughout grunge's life until it died. And their second host, John Keister, was a music journalist, and he actually got a lot of the grunge guys on their show. And was even Dave Grohl called that show his summer stock. That was where he got started being interested in acting, and where he sort of learned how to act and how to be funny. That's one of those shows that I really loved writing about because I had not heard of it, didn't grow up watching it or anything, but honestly had an outsized impact, one that you didn't expect. Like Joel McHale came out of there. A guy named Bob Nelson, who wrote the movie Nebraska, which was Oscar nominated, he came out of there, and that's where he started. Like that's where he learned how to do sketch. It's kind of this perfect microcosm of what sketch is and what it can be.
And again, Jason Klamm's with us, and we're talking about his new book, We're Not Worthy, From In Living Color to Mr. Show, How 90s Sketch TV Changed the Face of Comedy. As we mentioned, there were shows all over the U.S., of course, but you had your fair share in Canada and the U.K., and Nickelodeon had a few of them for kids. I mean, it was kind of taken over the entire decade.
Yeah, and I believe me, I really wanted to write about UK sketch comedy, but I limited it to two mentions of UK sketch comedy, because otherwise that's an entirely separate book. But I did do as much Canadian stuff as I could. Talked about the show called The Vacant Lot. Talked about Royal Canadian Air Force. As many as I could find and could get people to interview for. There's a lot of Canadian influence. I loved talking to those folks.
And it seemed like the ones for Nickelodeon, especially, some of those kind of harken back to maybe more like Monty Python kind of just weirdness, at least some of the ones that I remember.
Oh yeah. Like I was sort of like, I was hesitant to finish the book without having a chapter on all that. I think it does deserve a chapter on all that. I didn't get enough interviews to really make it its own chapter, but if we do a second edition of the book, that's my plan. I want to get some more people who are involved, even though it's not of my age. It's absolutely the thing a ton of people grew up on, and that Python influences. The other reason I think 90s sketch comedy is so good, because these are the first people who grew up watching Python, and now they're finally getting to make their own stuff. So you can see the influence. You can also see where people stray away from the Python style. Some people outright reject the Python style, but it is still sort of a response to it. So they're still kind of responsible for it. But yeah, I really love that sort of abstract humor. And they're honestly, even though I didn't grow up on like all that, and that's another thing too, is I didn't do most of the kids shows. There'd be too many. Most kids shows are basically sketch shows. Even though I didn't grow up on all that, there are a couple where I watched, I was like, oh, these are actually pretty good shows. I kind of missed out.
Well, could you say of all the sketch shows that you covered in the book, do you have one that's your favorite, or maybe a couple you could list off?
I would still say The State. The State still holds up to me as my favorite, and it is still the one that blew my mind the most. I think In Living Color also really holds up and is maybe like socially the most important. It did a lot in terms of like actually saying something with comedy, even in between some of the dumber stuff that they did. But The State's absolutely probably my favorite. And I was fortunate enough that The State's David Wayne did the foreword for the book, which I still having trouble believing.
Yeah, I would say for me, In Living Color probably would be my favorite. It seems like a lot of sketch shows like SNL and, some of those were pretty hit or miss. And for some reason, In Living Color, to me, I don't know, it always seemed to be good.
And on rewatch, that's still mostly the case. I mean, there's still plenty of stuff that doesn't age well, but of the stuff that does age well, it ages better than a lot of stuff, and is stuff that could stand to be basically redone on a sketch show today, because it's still stuff we're dealing with socially a lot.
Well, you mentioned reality TV. With the way things are now with Netflix specials for comedians and, YouTube shorts and that sort of thing, could we see maybe another resurgence of sketch comedy, or was that maybe just kind of a special time and place?
I think we could, because the thing is, there's more sketch comedy out there than there ever has been before. It's just not on TV and it's not on streaming. And I think that's partially because it's cheaper to put together a TV show based on a group that already exists, that already knows how to do a TV show, or already knows how to do sketches together. They've got a chemistry. And when you hunt down people on YouTube or TikTok, usually that's an individual. You don't put $250,000 an episode behind an individual. It's cheaper to put $250,000 an episode behind a 7-person group. And also, you can replace more people. You can't in a 7-person group. And that's how producers think. They're like, well, let's get the people out of here that don't work. But if it's just on the one person, you've just invested all that money in one person. And if that goes badly, then you've lost all your money. But long story short, I do think so. And I think it should happen. I just think people need to take more chances with those people who are out there making good TikToks and YouTube.
Well, and it does seem like a lot of the sketch comedies, SNL especially, a lot of people kind of use that as sort of a launching pad to become, big in film. I don't know if that still happens now or, if it could happen, but that seems like a good way to maybe cultivate, some of the stars that might be coming up.
It doesn't happen with the frequency it did in the 90s for sure. SNL is still the only place where you can not count on that, but at least you've got a reliable roadmap that you can follow. And there's a good chance, there are people on that show when the show is on, of course, due to all the strikes. But when people, there are people that I cannot wait to see get film careers like Ego Wodum and people like that. But it's still no guarantee, but the SNL is the best shot. I would like to see that I'd like to see a resurgence of sketch that also then reinforms how films are made, just like the 90s did. The 90s you can see that ripple constantly in movies and TV now.
Definitely. Well, Jason, I know the book is just out here. You mentioned maybe a part 2, or is there something else maybe in the works that we should be looking out for?
Well, we're going to look at a second edition, so basically an expanded edition. I would like down the line to maybe do something that covers UK sketch if I genuinely feel like I'm qualified. But I've got like 5 or 6 books that I am pitching as my potential book, so I don't know which one it is yet.
Well, whatever it is, I'm definitely looking forward to it. This book, We're Not Worthy, is great. And, I grew up in the 80s and in the 90s, so this is right in my wheelhouse. And Jason, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
And again, that was Jason Klamm. His new book, We're Not Worthy, From In Living Color to Mr. Show, How 90s Sketch TV Changed the Face of Comedy, is available now.